Worries about a second wave. The nation's top health officials testified at a Senate Health Committee hearing that contact tracing is critical. And in Dr. Fauci's words, there are worries that reopening without proper measures in place will only do irreversible damage.
There is a real risk that you will trigger an outbreak that you may not be able to control, which in fact, paradoxically, will set you back, not only leading to some suffering and death that could be avoided, but could even set you back on the road to trying to get economic recovery.
Now, Dr. Fauci says there have to be mechanisms to pull back if there's a dramatic spike. So despite the president's claim of victory, we cannot declare victory over the new coronavirus. Epidemiologist Dr. Jonathan Kantor from the Penn Center for Epidemiology joins me once again here in the morning show. So your take on yesterday's testimony?
Well, I think it was a very helpful bit of testimony. I think it really helped to contextualize what we're dealing with here. The challenge, of course, is that the idea of reopening, the idea of saying, okay, everybody, you can kind of start to leave your houses. That's not to say mission accomplished, as I've said with you a number of times, Bruce. It's not to say that, hey, we're done and there's no more concern. The idea is simply to say, okay, we've built enough capacity. My concern is a couple of things. Number one, have we really built that capacity? For example, a couple of the nation's leading medical suppliers, companies like McKesson and Henry Schein, they still don't have enough masks and PPE to supply even to the regular doctor's offices that are starting to operate now. So whether we have enough capacity to handle a surge is going to be a major, major question. The other thing to keep in mind is that on a personal level, keep in mind that going outside now, it's not like your risk has actually dropped from before. Your personal risk of contracting coronavirus is actually higher now than it was 2 months ago. Because, think about coronavirus like a green M&Ms that are in an M&Ms bag, that, if you've got more of those M&Ms in the bag, you're more likely to bump into them. And that's sort of the situation we're at right now. We're nowhere near herd immunity with 60, 70% immune. We've only got maybe 1 or 2% if we're lucky. So going outside now as an individual person with your family, to keep in mind that the risk for yourself is actually greater than it was a couple months ago.
Let me ask you about the antibody tests. They were supposed to help guide reopening plans, but they've actually brought about more confusion than clarity.
Yeah, antibody testing has been a real challenge. Part of the problem is that, when you approach any kind of intervention for a pandemic, you want to approach it scientifically. You want to say, what are we going to accomplish with this and how are we going to get there? And the problem is here that there is a scientific consensus that certainly there's value to doing these tests. But the problem is we sort of put the cart before the horse and said, okay, let's get so many tests available. I think the government was burned on the fact that testing was, slowed in terms of the initial coronavirus outbreak. So they said, well, let's open the floodgates to antibody testing. The problem, of course, with that is you began to get unregulated antibody testing. And so it wasn't done in an organized fashion. And even now, doctors don't necessarily know what to rely on, what not to. For most doctors, they're using serologic tests. They're using a blood test that you send into a laboratory. Those are very, very reliable. But some of those small test kits, if you see an ad on your email pop up to buy a test, for antibodies, I would not bother doing that. There's been a lot of concern about their reliability. You really want to approach it scientifically in an organized way. Israel, for example, is doing a study of 100,000 citizens looking at antibody levels, trying to get an idea of, are the antibodies even really protective? What difference does it make? But you've got to do that in an organized, rigorous, scientific way. Willy-nilly buying things off the internet that may or may not work, it's not going to give you any meaningful information.
And the panacea, people believe, will be the development of a vaccine. And there are several in phase 1 trials, and some think it'll be late fall or early winter at best before we know something. But Dr. Fauci said yesterday, his words, when it comes to a treatment, that might even be a bridge too far, expecting one too soon like fall.
Right. There are a number of key things to consider here. And I think we've even chatted about this before, even weeks ago, is that, with a vaccine, we've kind of hinged our expectations and our hopes and our dreams on these clinical trials that are happening. Well, number one, only a tiny fraction of vaccines are going to be able to successfully go from phase 1 trials into actual production. There are a number of hurdles that they have to meet. And these aren't regulatory hurdles. Those regulations have really been eased. These are just pragmatic hurdles to say, does it really work? Are we able to make sure that it helps everybody? The other thing is going to be very practical. Again, even if you come up with a vaccine, the Oxford team famously last week was talking about the fact that they may, by September, let's say, be able to produce a vaccine that works since it's been effective in some types of monkeys. But the issue there again is how are we going to make billions, not millions, of these vaccines, and the logistics behind that? I mean, we can't even get face masks. So if we can't even get face masks, to manufacture complex biologics like vaccines and distribute them effectively to billions of people is a major, major logistic challenge, and that is really going to be what stands in the way.
And in spite of what reopening may bring, it was also made very clear that we have to be prepared for that proverbial second wave that coincides with flu season.
Right. The thing to keep in mind here, and this is what I tried to allude to when I talked about the fact that it's actually less safe now going outside, is that we're in a lull because people have been inside. But as soon as we begin to get enough exposures and begin to get enough people that are exposed to other people that are able to really spread the virus, then suddenly you're going to deal with a situation where you may be getting those peaks that I talked about a few weeks ago again, where, yes, we've had this initial peak, but first of all, the second peak may actually be higher than the first, number one, and that's something which really hasn't been talked about a lot, but the second peak may end up being higher because, again, there's so many more people who are out there potentially spreading it. And number two, we may not have to wait till fall to see that. I suspect that this is going to happen much sooner. Of course, you can't really predict anything in a situation like this, but I would suspect that it is going to be well before fall when we begin to see problems related to that. So absolutely, we can't let our vigilance down.
Dr. Jonathan Kantor, thank you. 10 minutes away from 8 o'clock. You're watching The Morning Show, Weather Time.